Good evening, everyone. My name is Kania Langovin, and I'm a board member of Not in Our Town Princeton, and I'm happy to welcome you to Not in Our Town's continuing conversation on race and white privilege. We are hosted by the Princeton Public Library, which has been a steadfast partner in Not in Our Town's work for years. This presentation is being live streamed and recorded. When we go to the breakout rooms, however, those sessions will not be recorded. Not in Our Town is a racial justice organization founded in 1998. Since its inception, Not in Our Town has held events to educate and raise community awareness of continuing racism and to promote activities to combat it. For over a decade, Not in Our Town's continuing conversations have taken place on the first non-holiday Monday of each month to provide the opportunity for people from different backgrounds to hear speakers and to talk to each other about race-related topics. I'm very happy to introduce my fellow board member, Joyce Trotman-Jordan, to read the land acknowledgement and the Not in Our Town mission statement.
Thank you, Connie. Our land acknowledgement. The land on which we are living is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people. We pay respect to the Lenni Lenape people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in their homeland and in the diaspora. We also acknowledge the millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants on whose backs this nation was created.
And Joyce, will you please read the mission statement?
Also?
Yes, please.
Not in Our Town, Princeton is a multiracial, multi-faith group of individuals who stand together for racial justice and inclusive communities. Our focus is to promote the equitable treatment of all and to uncover and confront white supremacy, the system that facilitates the preference, privilege, and power of white people at the expense of non-white people, and pits racial and ethnic groups against each other by upholding a hierarchy based on the proximity to whiteness. Our goal is to identify and expose the political, economical, and cultural systems which have enabled white supremacy to flourish, and to create new structures and policies which will ensure equity and inclusion for all. In our commitment to uncovering the blight of white supremacy on our humanity, we take responsibility to address it and eliminate it in all its forms through intentional actions, starting with ourselves and our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. I'm honored to introduce tonight's speaker. Brooke Lewis is Associate Counsel for Criminal Justice Reform at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Serving on the independent monitoring team overseeing reforms to the Newark Police Division, NPD, she provides assistance to the NPD in the areas of community-oriented and bias-free policing. Beyond her work on the independent monitoring team, Brooke advocates for community-driven policing and public safety reforms. Prior to joining the Institute, Brooke served as a law clerk at the New Jersey Superior Court Appellate Division and worked as a legal intern at the New Jersey Office of the Public Defender, the Capitol Habeas Unit of the Federal Community Defender Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, and the Rutgers Children's Justice Clinic. As a graduate of the Rutgers BA/JD dual degree program, Brooke received a BA in Political Science, summa cum laude, and a JD cum laude with a certificate in Criminal Law and Procedure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so honored to be here and engage in this conversation with you. My name's Brooke Lewis, and I'm Associate Counsel at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And I think I'll try to share my screen now because I do have a PowerPoint. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you again so much for having me. My presentation tonight is going to be called Beyond the Hashtag, Making Black Lives Matter in New Jersey. So earlier this year, the Institute released our 2021-2022 action agenda, which really just maps out our policy priorities to make Black lives really matter here in New Jersey. So as you can see, my sense is that a lot of you follow our work, which is awesome. But this kind of really is an overview of what we view as the primary policy priorities that are really necessary to address the real systemic racism we have throughout our state. And so this agenda is really far reaching, and it starts with, looking at the racial wealth gap and closing it through a variety of policy proposals, transforming the youth justice system, keeping communities safe, which is what I'd like to talk about tonight, which focuses on creating a culture of accountable policing while also making investments in community-based public safety options. It's looking at making sure there's democracy for all in our state, as well as repairing the harm of racism. So as I mentioned, a lot of my work at the Institute focuses on our policing advocacy. So one part of that is since 2016, the Institute has served on the independent monitoring team, which is currently overseeing reforms to the Newark Police Division as part of the larger federal consent decree process. So in our role as subject matter experts in community-oriented policing, bias-free policing, and community engagement, we're really there to aim to make sure that the community is at the heart of the entire reform process. However, even as we're looking to strengthen police accountability through the consent decree, as well as other processes, we think it's equally important for us to also be rethinking policing as an institution and really working toward reducing its footprint in ways that make sense. So to achieve these goals, the Institute's 2021-2022 action agenda is looking to pursue both community-centered police reforms that create a culture of accountable policing, as well as looking at ways we can really invest in community-based resources. So before we really look at some of the reforms that are going on in Newark right now, I think it's really important to reflect on the history of policing within the city, and specifically the Newark Rebellion. So for those who aren't familiar, on July 12, 1967, Newark residents protested the abuse of a Black cab driver named John W. Smith. So what happened was that night, John Smith drove his cab around two double parked police cars. The police didn't like this. They asked him to stop. They pulled him over. They removed him from the cab and they assaulted him. Later, he was then taken to the 4th precinct where they continued to assault him. And it was these sorts of violent and racially discriminatory encounters with police that was coupled with unequal access to economic and political resources that really catalyzed the Newark Rebellion. It was the same thing that fueled a lot of protests and rebellions in cities across America that same year. And again, as we see today. Now, the toll of the rebellion was really staggering on the city. It left 26 people dead, over 700 people injured, and about $10 million in damages. And even beyond these tangible ramifications, in the aftermath of the rebellion, a lot of people really felt that the relationship between law enforcement and the community was beyond repair. So then we fast forward to 2010, and ACLU New Jersey petitions the US Department of Justice, alleging widespread civil rights abuses perpetrated by the Newark Police Division. So this petition was granted, and then the Department of Justice did go ahead and do an investigation. Then in 2014, they released their investigatory findings, which essentially substantiated these allegations. So among the findings were that about 75% of police stops were unconstitutional, over 20% of reported uses of force were unreasonable and excessive, and then Black residents were more than twice as likely to be stopped than their white counterparts. So it was really a result of this investigation that led the Department of Justice and the city of Newark to enter into the current consent decree that we have now. When it was finalized on May 5th, 2016, and it really brings a series of much needed reforms. So as you can see here, the consent decree is a really comprehensive reform process. So it requires the Newark Police Division to do lots of different reforms related to training, community engagement, their stop searches and arrest practices, their bias-free policing policies and practices, use of force, body-worn cameras, property, data, complaint and intake investigation, and discipline. So it's a really comprehensive undertaking that's been happening these last few years. So in particular, the Institute has worked with the department in developing reforms specifically in the areas of community-oriented policing and bias-free policing. while also doing a lot of community engagement work to make sure that Newark residents have the opportunity to participate in this reform process whenever possible. So, for example, in the area of community-oriented policing, we've worked with the department in developing its community-oriented policing policy. So among many other things, this policy really seeks to ensure that NPD meets regularly with community members to make sure they're constantly receiving feedback and input on their practices. And it also requires NPD to review community complaints that are made to make sure that they can sort of constantly be improving their community-oriented policing practices on an ongoing basis. We also notably have worked with them to develop a First Amendment policy. And this is really important because, among other things, it protects residents' ability to record police conduct, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And then we're also working with them closely to work on developing a youth engagement strategy. And essentially what that would do is it would provide officers with specific guidance and instruction on how they should be interacting with young people to make sure that those interactions are informed by best practices on sound youth development and trauma-informed care. So then next, we also do a lot of the community engagement work. So we're really working to ensure that residents are, number one, kept up to date on the status of the consent decree, and also that they have the opportunity to participate, because we want to make sure this process is really responsive to community needs. So over the past several years, this has involved us hosting community forums, conducting the annual community survey, and creating opportunities for residents to provide feedback on draft policies and trainings. And then lastly, we also help out with the bias-free policing reform efforts. So we've worked with the Newark Police to develop bias-free policing policies and trainings, which among other things teaches officers methods for combating implicit bias. And we've also worked with them in developing an LGBTQIA community and police interactions policy, which provides instruction to officers on how to interact with community members of the LGBTQIA community. So just one final note on the consent decree work. If you would like to learn more about the consent decree process, and if you're a Newark resident and you would like to get involved, please do visit our website to read our consent decree toolkit, which kind of gives a general overview. It's kind of a complicated document and process in some ways. And so we wanted to put this together to kind of just give a high level overview of what the process is actually doing and concrete ways community members and residents can still get involved in the process. So for the past several years, most of the Institute's policing work has really focused on the consent decree process. And now we're at a stage where we're seeking to use these experiences to advocate for much broader policing and public safety reform statewide. So here, before we start that discussion, I think it's important to really take a look at the stark racial disparities New Jersey's criminal justice system does have at every stage. So you see the first point here is that a Black child is almost 18 times more likely to be in prison in New Jersey than a white child. So that is outrageous. For those of you who follow our work, you've probably heard that that number was 21 to 1. So it has improved a little bit in the latest numbers, but we're still have the worst Black to white racial disparity in the nation with that 18 to 1 disparity. It's also reflected for adults. So Black adults are 12 times more likely to be incarcerated than white adults here in the state. That's also the worst racial disparity in the country. And then we also see that Black people in our state are more than 3 times more likely to have police force used against them. So it's important to keep in mind that when we look to create more accountability and sort of reimagine public safety, these are sort of the systemic issues we hope to address. So when we look to create a culture of accountable policing, this is by no means comprehensive or all the work that needs to be done. But when we kind of look at what we have in our state, these are the next concrete steps we can do, and we think are relatively easy and straightforward to begin to create a culture of accountability and creating that system of accountability so that law enforcement is more responsive to the communities that they serve. So one thing we'd like the state to do, and that the Institute is working with our partners to advocate for, is we want to see First Amendment policies created in police departments that will protect civilians' rights during police encounters. So as I mentioned, as part of the consent decree process, the Institute has worked with the Newark Police to draft a new policy that provides specific procedures for how police officers should be interacting with recording bystanders to make sure that their First Amendment rights to record police conduct are protected. So we saw recently that the Attorney General updated our state's use of force policies, and we'd like to see a similar effort be done in the area of the First Amendment right to record police. So in partnership with our friends at ACLU New Jersey, we've recently released a policy brief called To Record and Protect. And this document really urges the Attorney General's office to create a statewide First Amendment policy that will ultimately be the framework to guide law enforcement interaction with recording bystanders. And it's an important point because as we seek to increase transparency and build trust, it really is critical to empower community members. It's just like we saw with Darnella Frazier, who filmed George Floyd's murder, to hold law enforcement accountable through exercising their First Amendment rights to both criticize and record police conduct. So then next, we also want to see our state take some concrete steps to really limit military grade equipment that's available to local law enforcement agencies through the federal 1033 program. So the federal 1033 program is basically a program that allows local law enforcement agencies to apply for surplus military equipment from the Department of Defense for almost little to no cost. So we really want to create more accountability and transparency around how this program works in our state. So we'd like the Attorney General's office to direct the Office of Emergency and Management to review the 1033 program to get a better understanding of, how local departments use this program here in the state, as well as increase statewide oversight and transparency regarding the transfer of military equipment to local departments. So we want to know, who has what equipment here, what is the purpose of it, and just have more transparency around how this program is militarizing our police in the state. Next, we also want to see New Jersey's legislature pass legislation that would both ban and criminalize police use of chokeholds. So we still have not done that in the state, and currently pending in the legislature is Assembly Bill 4284 and Senate Bill S2617. Both of these would make the use of chokeholds by law enforcement a first-degree crime that's punishable by up to 20 years in prison and or up to a $200,000 fine. We also want to see our state really strive to minimize the harmful effects of over-policing by reducing enforcement of non-serious offenses, particularly for youth. So our state did take a meaningful step toward reducing law enforcement's footprint with the recent Attorney General directive that bolsters transparency around the use of station house adjustments. And this is something the Institute has been advocated for since 2016. So this directive, among other things, requires each state, county, and local law enforcement agency to report and collect data on the use of station house adjustments on a quarterly basis and to make this information publicly available. And then lastly, we also want to work on other key reform efforts like ending qualified immunity, which is a legal doctrine that often prevents people and who have experienced police abuse from actually holding their assailants accountable in court. And we also want to see the state pass legislation that would allow civilian complaint review boards to actually have subpoena power. We know that's a really important power for civilian complaint review boards to actually hold law enforcement accountable and investigate allegations of misconduct. So even as we work on all these reforms, which we believe are really sort of a foundational step that's necessary to improve law outcomes and safety for communities across our state, we also need to be looking for ways to actually invest in community-based public safety options. So one thing that we can do and that we see is being done successfully in a lot of places around the country is developing mental health first responder and crisis intervention systems that will rely on highly trained professionals other than police to address certain crises. So in Oregon, for example, the CAHOOTS program has for 31 years provided 24/7 crisis intervention in situations that would otherwise be handled by police. We've also seen the STAR program in Denver, which was implemented as a pilot in June 2020, has shown significant success in its first 6 months, responding to 748 calls without police. And as you see the statistic there, people living with an untreated severe mental illness account for at least 1 in 4 of all fatal police interactions. And so we know that if we can really decrease interactions between law enforcement and people experiencing a mental health crisis, that can be a really important step toward reducing serious police violence. And then next, we also need to be investing in community-based services that empower communities like schools, hospitals, libraries, and parks. These are the types of resources that keep communities safe and prevent even the need for any sort of outside intervention. And we know that's extremely important too. So to develop a community-based system of public safety, we really think that we need to be investing in resources that support healthy communities. We've seen cities like Minneapolis and Boston have cut their police budgets to instead invest in important community resources like mental health services, economic development, and violence prevention. And here in Newark, we actually have the Newark Community Street Team, which is working as a highly successful community-based violence prevention program. And in this program, Newark residents are trained in conflict de-escalation and resolution to ultimately reduce crime and violence in the community. And thankfully, in 2020, the city of Newark really acknowledged this success and reallocated 5% of the public safety budget to create the Office of Violence Prevention, which will serve as the headquarters for the Newark Community Street Team. So that's sort of an overview of what we're doing around public safety advocacy with our partners in the state. I wanted to point out a few concrete actions that we can all take. If you've heard something that you'd like to help with, I think these are some things you can do. You can certainly contact your state legislatures to urge them to ban law enforcement chokeholds in New Jersey. I have the link up there, but our website has all of our phone to action links, which can make it really easy to reach out to legislators on specific issues. So please do visit our website for those if you're interested. Similarly, you can also contact your state legislatures to urge them to pass legislation that would finally allow for strong civilian complaint review boards in our state. You can also take a look, as I mentioned, of our consent decree toolkit, which really is an easy to read outlay of what the consent decree process is, where it stands today, and how you can get involved. You can also read To Record and Protect, which really makes the argument for creating statewide standards for protecting the right to record police conduct. And then lastly, you can read our Institute's 2021-2022 action agenda to see how you can make Black lives really matter in New Jersey. I'm talking about our public safety advocacy, which is where I spend most of my time, but we work on a lot of different issues and all of them are interrelated. And it'll really give you some suggestions on what are the really key pieces that we can take action on today. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brooke. That was a wonderful talk, and thank you for the amazing advocacy that you do. Usually the format is that we have community small group discussions, but Mickey, do you want to allow the audience to ask a few questions of Brooke? Yeah, okay. Does anyone have any questions for Brooke?
Are we just responding, or are you acknowledging my hand being raised?
Oh, I couldn't see it. Simona, you want to go first?
Oh, I didn't see it. Go ahead. Okay, yeah.
Okay, yeah. My question, Brooke, thank you so much. Great presentation. Newark has been doing this for approximately 5 years, and I'm curious about what are the plans for creating similar independent monitoring teams in Trenton and Camden or other urban areas that are just as adversely affected by police monitoring?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So consent decrees were a tool that was very popular during the Obama administration, and it's unclear how popular they will be moving forward. So how they came to be is like in Newark's, the ACLU New Jersey petitioned the Department of Justice, which did the investigation. And that is what ultimately lays the groundwork for the city of Newark and the Department of Justice to enter into a consent decree. So it's a bit of a legal process that has to happen for a formal consent decree to be put in place. However, I hope, and some of the questions that I've suggested for the breakout groups are to really think about, what are the things that you can do now without a consent decree that we've sort of learned. And so it's talking about, what are good practices? Like, should your police department be having monthly meetings with community stakeholders? Should they be creating a First Amendment policy to make sure that officers are trained and have knowledge about how they should be interacting with people who are recording them, because that is a First Amendment right. And so I hope that some of the lessons that we've learned here can be applicable in other cities, including Trenton and Camden and Atlantic City, without the need for a formal consent decree. But that's a good question.
Okay, thank you.
Ted, would you like to go next?
Okay, thank you. Brooke, like Simona, I've got all kinds of good things to say about your presentation. Thank you so much. But I wonder if you would be willing to say just a few more words about the mental health response system, either from Eugene, Oregon, or from Denver, or anyplace else. Is this like a parallel system, like a 911 system, but it's one is a law enforcement system and one is a mental health system? And if it is a parallel system, how does somebody decide which one to call on?
Those are the questions. So a lot of these programs, it's a situation, and the Institute is certainly looking at research to kind of identify what are the best practices, what's working, what's not. And it seems to be a situation where no two are exactly alike. And all the questions you're raising are exactly the questions that a lot of communities and advocates are asking is, should it be, where is it housed within the police department? Is it a totally separate department? A lot of these programs, these successful ones, are a separate entity that you can contact. A lot of them do have separate phone lines that you can call. However, most of them can also respond with police as well. But yeah, there's no like universal format for these. I think what we are trying to push our state and what we would like to do is to start having conversations on the community level of how could this work in this particular community? What are the resources around mental health that are already available, and how can we build them to make sure that they are more complementary of law enforcement, and how do we expand those to make sure that whenever possible, we don't need to rely on police, because I think that's also a big part of it is, whenever you have to call the police, that is a dangerous crisis situation. And so in addition to building out those sort of responder systems, we also want to look critically at what are the other resources that we could be investing in that could prevent those crisis situations in the first place. But yeah, I think all of those are the great questions. And I think right now, New Jersey is in the phase where we're trying to talk with communities and figure out what could this look like in each community, because no two are exactly alike. And I also don't think every community is looking for the same thing. And I think that's also something that's super important to remember about policing, that as much as there are sort of like global things that we need to implement, it should be a community level conversation.
Thank you. Jim, would you like to go next?
Sure. Now, you mentioned something about station house adjustments, and that's not something that, not a term I've heard before. So can you explain that?
Yeah, so that's definitely Retha Onatiri for those of you who follow the Institute. She has led that work for us, but station house adjustments are essentially a diversion type of program where instead of, filing charges or moving forward with the criminal justice system, youth are diverted to other programs to address their needs. So it's basically a diversion program that instead of filing formal charges, if a youth does have contact with the criminal justice system, they could be diverted to a community program that better addresses their needs.
Sounds like a good idea. So is Newark doing that?
So those are some of the questions. So the directive that was passed is requiring law enforcement agencies to actually report out on how are these station house adjustments being used. So that's part of what the Institute is working to get more information on.
Thank you. Caroline, oh, sorry. Caroline, do you want to go next? Caroline's question is in the chat, Brooke.
Oh, okay. So does Newark Civilian Review Board have authority to subpoena police internal affairs files, police camera recordings, recommend discipline? That's a great question. So yes, for those of you who don't know, a lot of the Civilian Complaint Review Board advocacy that's happening now was born out of Newark. So Newark created a Civilian Complaint Review Board. It worked closely with our friends at ACLU New Jersey to figure out what was really necessary for Civilian Complaint Review Boards to be effective. And some of those things that they found were there needed to be subpoena power, which allowed them to get information to fully investigate individual allegations of police misconduct, the ability to do concurrent investigations, and the ability to recommend discipline. So what happened was they created the Civilian Complaint Review Board. It went all the way to the New Jersey Supreme Court. It was challenged by the police unions. The Supreme Court did in their decision say that some of these features were inconsistent with current state law, but they did say that the legislature could change this. And so that's where some of these pending bills have come from. And so right now, those features of the Civilian Complaint Review Board in Newark, the subpoena power, concurrent investigations, were found to be inconsistent with state law. So they're not able to do that. But part of the advocacy that's been happening in Newark around the state is to pass these bills to make sure that not just in Newark, but states across the state could actually create strong CCRBs.
Thank you. And then Mary Susan Gregson.
Hi, is the microphone on?
Yeah.
Hi, actually, I'm Albert. It's my question. I wonder, how is it decided how police are trained? Trained in what to do, trained in what not to do? How is that decided, and who decides that?
Those are really good questions. So it's a combination of things. So first of all, the law, as well as the Attorney General, sort of sets standards either through directives or laws that would kind of do the framework for what's actually required. There's also the Police Training Commission, which drafts or creates the training that all New Jersey officers need to receive before they actually join the force. But then beyond that, a lot of that is just left beyond that sort of general framework. A lot of it is just left up to individual departments, which, sometimes it can be hard to understand what that actually looks like from the outside. And I think it can vary quite a bit from department. But that's another thing the Institute is trying to get more information and understanding of, because it seems like, sort of beyond these sort of broad requirements created either by the Attorney General's office or the law, it's really hard to know what each department is receiving training on and how often.
Thank you.
Olinda, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Brooke, for this great presentation. I have a question about the measurements that are used to understand what the police are doing and if there's any racial bias involved. For example, the Princeton police publish a monthly report, and they even break down things like the traffic stops and so forth by race, but they do it in a way that makes it difficult to understand whether there's a bias or not, because they don't compare it to the population as a whole. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of a model that the Institute could create that could be presented to local police agencies to say, if you would do this in presenting your statistics, it would make it easier for the public to understand exactly what you're doing.
I completely agree. And I think that's something we've thought about a lot. I think a lot of issues around policing do come down to a lack of transparency. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Force Report, which came out in 2018. And that really just highlighted, not only were the results themselves extremely troubling, but it was even more troubling that there really wasn't a mechanism within our government that would do this itself, right? At the end of the day, all of these disparities in use of force throughout the state and throughout departments and even within departments wasn't something that our state was set up to detect on its own. It required outside journalists. And so, yes, I completely agree. And I think that, you know, as we've had like a lot of technological advances that have allowed us to sort of create early warning systems now. Some departments are developing early warning systems, which can essentially try to detect which officers are at risk for committing misconduct before they do it. So it'll mine, you know, all sorts of information about their past conduct and things like that, and then be able to identify, okay, this person is showing signs of somebody who would commit misconduct. Let's do early intervention. So I think all of that, I mean, that's a little bit different than what you posed, because you importantly pointed out that it's not that this information isn't there, it's just not accessible to the public, which I agree is a problem that I think we need to continually work on. But yeah, I'm hopeful that a lot of, as technology kind of starts to get more and more integrated into our local departments, a lot of that will become more transparent, probably require some advocacy, but hopefully we'll be getting a lot more of that sort of high level information that can really inform us on terms of how our policing is actually working.
Thank you so much, Brooke. We really appreciate the amazing advocacy you do. And I think we're going to do our small groups now, but thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank
So,
you. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. That's fine. Okay. All right. So there are several community agreements that we ask people to take into consideration during the conversations in the breakout rooms. And please note that there will be a facilitator in each room to help you with this. Please listen to each other respectfully so that each person has an opportunity to be heard. Please step up and step back. People are encouraged to overcome the reluctance to talk, and also take care not to dominate the conversation. Allow everyone to have equal airtime. Be careful not to interrupt when someone else is speaking. And please agree to respect one another's privacy by keeping this discussion and people's names and identities confidential. We ask that you embrace the concept that whatever is said or shared in this room stays in this room. Please speak from your own personal experience to avoid making generalizations. White people may feel uncomfortable when a person of color shares a hard truth. They should also understand that sharing these truths can be painful or even traumatic for the person of color. And now we'll go into the discussion questions. So the discussion questions are, have you ever recorded police conduct? If so, what was your experience? If not, would you be willing to record? What should accountable policing look like in your community? And are there any non-police first responders available in your community? Which situations currently handled by the police do you think might be better addressed by other professionals? Not in Our Towns continuing conversations take place on the first non-holiday Monday of each month. Next month, because of Labor Day, we'll be meeting on the second Monday of the month. So that's Monday, September 13th at 7 p.m. right back here on Zoom. And Dr. Ying Lu and I will be speaking on the topic, Stop Asian American and Pacific Islander Hate, Standing in Solidarity. The presentation will focus on the escalation of hate crimes towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and efforts to address them, the origin of and the damage caused by the model minority and unknown Asian American and Pacific Islander history, and the history of Asian American and Black solidarity during the time of Frederick Douglass and the Chinese Exclusion Act, during the Civil Rights Movement, and in the present. So hope you can join us. Thanks everyone for a wonderful evening.
And thank you, Brooke Lewis. I see you're still here. Thank you so much.
Oh,
yeah,
is
thank you
Brooke
so
still here? Oh, there she is. Whom did you clerk for in the appellate division, Brooke?
It was Judge Leone. He actually retired right after I left. Yeah, thank you.
I remember Judge Leone. It's
Oh,
good.
do you?
Thank you so much, Brooke.
Yeah, it was truly a pleasure. I really appreciate you having me.
Thank
Thank you so
very
much for the wonderful work you do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
You
much.
make us
Brooke.
very hopeful, Brooke, both for the present and of course the future.
Oh, great. Thank you all so much. I hope I can come back.
Okay.
Yes.